Mystery. Imagine for a second you wake up millions of miles from Earth. You are the sole surviving human on a desperate mission to save humanity. And right next door, separated only by a sheer wall of transparent material called xenonite, is an alien species. You have no shared language, no shared culture, and a fundamentally different biology. How on Earth, or rather how in space, do you even begin to communicate? Well, welcome to our explainer on one of the most fascinating first contact scenarios ever conceived. This is a situation where survival depends entirely on observation, adaptation, and honestly, a whole lot of duct tape level ingenuity. It's the ultimate test of the scientific method, a tool you use every day, just applied to a completely alien neighbor. We have to start with this immediate, life or death physical problem because it completely sets the stage for everything that follows. We aren't just dealing with a language barrier here. We are dealing with a lethal environmental barrier. The alien, who our protagonist Rylan Grace affectionately nicknames Rocky, breathes a pressurized atmosphere of superheated ammonia. It's an environment so extreme that if that thin dividing wall were to breach, it would mean instant death. So before we can even think about talking, we have to figure out how to safely hand things to each other. Moving on to part 1, the alien airlock. So let's look at our first major breakthrough to understand Rocky's engineering. To solve this physical transfer problem, Rocky does something absolutely baffling from a human engineering perspective. He builds an airlock out of flat panels instead of cylinders. Now, if you know anything about pressure vessels, you know they're almost always cylindrical or spherical, right? Because flat walls under extreme pressure tend to just bow and burst. The fact that Rocky constructs this square lock out of this transparent xenonite material without a second thought, it practically screams at us that this alien material possesses an absurd, almost magical structural strength. This newly constructed 1-foot xenite cube literally physically separates the two entirely different environments, while simultaneously acting as the bridge between them. Grace finds this cube jutting into his side of the tunnel, and it's complete with a crank and a door that's perfectly suited to his human hands. It is just a brilliant olive branch of engineering. So now they have a safe chamber to exchange physical objects. And Grace decides to send over his very first gift, a standard human metric tape measure, hoping to establish a shared concept of length. And this is what brilliantly illustrates the extreme contrast between the two beings. Grace places the tape measure into the square lock, Rocky fills it with his atmosphere, and the moment that heavy-duty, tool-grade rubber grip hits the iridian environment, bam, it instantly turns into a floating blob of liquid rubber. It just melts. But what's really fascinating is Rocky's reaction. He just opens the door, carefully grabs the surviving metal part of the tape, and casually shakes the blistering hot liquid rubber off his claw, kind of like a human shaking water off their hand. Lethal horror for us, right? Just a minor annoyance for him.
Which brings us to part 2, the mystery of sight.
This leads to a really frustrating roadblock in communication, but it eventually sparks a massive revelation about how this alien actually experiences the universe. Grace attempts to use that surviving tape measure to teach Rocky basic math and distance. He points to the high-contrast black and white centimeter markings on the metal tape, but Rocky just kind of plays with it. He pulls the tape out, lets it snap back, squeals with glee at the recoil, and completely, utterly ignores the visual markings. Grace taps the 1 centimeter line repeatedly, practically trying to force Rocky to look at it, but Rocky just taps the metal back in a matching rhythm, totally missing the visual cue. Grace actually gets so exasperated he literally shouts at the dividing wall, "Are you blind?"
So let's piece the clues together here, because Grace is a scientist, and he immediately starts analyzing the evidence, leading to a startling hypothesis. Clue number 1, Rocky completely ignores the highly visible ink on the tape measure. 2, Rocky had previously showed Grace a clock, but the numbers on it were unusually thick and raised. And 3, when Rocky tried to read Grace's human clock earlier, he had a really hard time until it was physically pressed flush against the dividing wall. All of these clues point to one astonishing conclusion. Rocky doesn't see light.
All right, part 3, the echolocation experiment. To test if this is echolocation, Grace forms a hypothesis. Iridians use an incredibly advanced form of passive sonar. They don't emit clicks like bats. They just naturally perceive the ambient sound waves bouncing around their environment to form a perfect 3D map. But he needs an undeniable test. So he grabs a 1/16-inch sheet of solid opaque aluminum. He knows that light absolutely cannot pass through this metal, but ultra-high-frequency sound waves, they can pass right through it with only a tiny bit of distortion. It's the perfect test for passive echolocation.
So, Grace holds his hand strictly behind the solid metal panel. First, he holds up 2 fingers, and to his total amazement, Rocky immediately mimics him, holding up 2 fingers on the other side. Grace switches to 1 finger, then jumps to 5. Rocky flawlessly mimics the numbers behind the metal wall every single time. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Iridians see using incredibly advanced sonar. And suddenly, that explains why Rocky needed the human clock pressed against the wall. He needed the mechanical ticking vibrations to transfer directly into the wall so his sonar could pick up the moving hands inside the plastic casing. It is an absolutely paradigm-shifting scientific deduction.
Next up, Part 4, Absolute Immunity. Now, knowing Rocky communicates and perceives the world through complex audio, how do we actually decode it? Well, to understand the solution, we have to look back at Earth. In a fascinating flashback, we see Mission Commander Strat, the woman completely in charge of saving humanity, standing all alone in federal court. And she is facing a massive lawsuit from a consortium of furious software companies and publishers. Why? Because the project literally stole and copied every single piece of copyrighted software, every book, and every database on Earth onto the ship's hard drives without paying a single dime in licensing fees. This really demonstrates the absolute terrifying stakes of the mission. Strat tells the judge flat out they simply do not have the time to negotiate licensing. She states, "We are giving them everything. Because the astronauts might face entirely unknown challenges, they need every conceivable software tool in human history at their fingertips." And when the judge actually threatens to arrest her, Strat produces a preemptive presidential pardon, an international treaty granting her total immunity, and, just for good measure, she has 5 armed U.S. military soldiers enter the courtroom to enforce her authority. The normal rules of human society were just completely thrown out the window to ensure this ship was prepared for anything. Which leads right into Part 5, Decoding Alien Audio. And it turns out that ruthless intellectual property theft, it's exactly what saves Grace in the present day. Digging through this massive, stolen digital library, Grace searches for something, anything, that can analyze complex sound. He finds a high-end commercial program called the Tympanum Labs Waveform Analyzer. The key feature of the software is that it performs what's called a Fourier transform. Now, without getting bogged down in the complex math, a Fourier transform essentially takes a messy, complex sound wave, like a strange chord played by an alien, and breaks it down into a simple, readable list of the individual musical notes that make it up. So if Rocky speaks in a chord, the software instantly translates it to say, hey, he's playing a C, an E, and a G. I absolutely love his solution here. It's wonderfully practical. He takes 2 laptops and literally tapes them back to back. Forget multi-million-dollar translation hardware. The absolute pinnacle of first contact diplomacy is held together by adhesive. On the front laptop, he runs Microsoft Excel, and on the back laptop facing the alien tunnel, he runs the stolen audio analyzer. He's setting up a crude but highly effective translation matrix. The analyzer will break down Rocky's alien chords into musical notes, and Grace will log those notes into his Excel spreadsheet, assigning a human word to each unique chord. Step by step, note by note, he is literally preparing to learn a new musical language. Finally, Part 6, Synchronizing Alien Clocks. But before he can even start this monumental translation task, basic biology steps in. The guy is exhausted, but he doesn't want Rocky to think humans are untrustworthy by just disappearing without warning. So he sets up a spreadsheet to mathematically convert human time into Iridian time. Humans use base 10 math, mostly because we have 10 fingers. Iridians, it turns out, use base 6 mathematics. Rocky's clock displays time in a 5-digit Iridian format. Grace has to do the heavy mathematical lifting to convert his required 8 hours of human sleep into Rocky's specific alien base 6 time system, just so he can tell him exactly when I'll be back. And remember, we just proved definitively that Rocky can't see ink on a piece of paper, so Grace has to use a beautifully low-tech solution to solve this high-tech problem. He goes back to the lab, grabs some wooden popsicle sticks, and tapes them directly onto the divider wall, physically spelling out the Iridian symbols for the time he'll return. It's a tactile sign for a blind alien. It perfectly encapsulates the whole vibe of this explainer, observing the problem, adjusting to the alien's reality, and using whatever random stuff is on hand to bridge the gap. So Grace heads to bed, leaving his popsicle stick message on the wall and his taped-together translation laptops ready to go. With the barrier of sight finally understood and the mathematical foundation for translating their musical language laid out in an Excel spreadsheet, a massive, massive question remains. When they finally bridge that gap, what profound, or maybe beautifully mundane thing will humanity and the Iridians actually say to each other first? More importantly, if you were standing at that dividing wall, what would you say? Think about that, and until next time, keep exploring.